The Ontario Science Centre opened in 1969 and has been drawing tourists and locals ever since. So it came as a surprise to many when the Ontario government abruptly and permanently shut it down on July 21, 2024 with only a few hours' notice. Their reasoning? An engineering firm had issued a report that showed several roof tiles were in desperate need of repair and could collapse as early as the next winter. Despite the apparent safety concerns, the closing has been controversial, with many calling it a calculated political move. But why? To answer that question, we have to look at how the Science Centre is connected to another beloved and dilapidated Ontario landmark, Ontario Place, that is currently undergoing a massive revitalization effort, and ask whether the changes to Ontario Place and the Science Centre are a product of a government's best effort to improve Canada's largest city, or a symptom of corruption. To understand the Science Centre's predicament, we have to first understand what's happening at Ontario Place. Ontario Place has a long history. It was opened in 1971 as a summer theme park, including a kids space, exhibit and event space, an amphitheater, marina, restaurants, an IMAX theater, and more. The design of Ontario Place won a number of design and architectural awards. Despite all of that, Ontario Place struggled to make money. In its first year, attendance was 2.5 million people, but the park still ran a $2.2 million deficit. The next year, the government raised admission prices and privatized a few of the restaurants in the park, but still lost money. Ontario Place was intended to be a tourist attraction to draw people to Ontario, yet as a publicly owned park, the park's subsidy was consistently higher than its revenue, becoming an ongoing pain point for the Ontario government. Despite a wide array of changes to the park over the coming decades, Ontario Place was never really profitable. In 2010, one last-ditch attempt was made to revitalize the park. Over $10 million was spent on improvements, live entertainment performances were quadrupled, they launched a new ad campaign that was highly successful, and it worked. First-time attendance increased by 89%, revenue increased by double-digit figures across the board, and visitor perception improved. Yet, 2011 would be Ontario Place's last season. The Ontario Liberal government led by Dalton McGuinty said the park was losing up to $20 million a year and chose to shut it down, issuing a request for information for ideas from private bidders to completely redevelop the park. Over the next few years, the concert space and IMAX theater remained open, and in 2017, part of the East Island was changed from a parking lot into Trillium Park, a free public space including 1.3 kilometers of walking trails. Each successive government continued to seek proposals from private entities on how to revitalize the rest of the park. None of those plans went anywhere until 2023, when Doug Ford's Ontario government announced a new vision for Ontario Place. The new plan includes a partnership with Therma, an Austrian spa company, to develop a mega spa, Live Nation, who will further develop Budweiser Stage, and the Ontario Science Centre, who will move from their now closed location to a much smaller facility at Ontario Place. Before we get back to the Science Centre, I want to look at the development and the Ontario government's increasingly shady activities surrounding it, especially the Therma Spa. From a business perspective, there are a number of competing spas within a 10-kilometer radius, raising questions about if the mega spa will get enough business. Ontario Place is basically across the street from Hotel X, a luxury hotel and spa itself. The Ontario government has taken drastic steps to ensure their plans are not interrupted. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow has opposed the province's plans, but the province owns most of the land at Ontario Place, and threatened to expropriate the rest of the land from the city if an agreement wasn't reached. Then the province made a deal with Toronto to take on the tax burden of the Gardiner Expressway and Don Valley Parkway, the two main traffic arteries of the city, in exchange for Toronto not opposing the redevelopment plans. The cost of the Gardiner and DVP are in the billions of dollars. And finally, an advocacy group entitled Ontario Place for All took the government to court because the Therma Mega Spa was going to be built without an environmental assessment, despite its plans to cut down at least 800 trees and the presence of a number of at-risk species on the island. Shortly after the court application was filed, the government passed a law, the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act, which exempted the province from the Environmental Assessment Act. The bill also allows the provincial infrastructure minister to issue zoning orders, something that previously had to be done on the municipal level, an open-ended and significant change. So why all this effort for a spa that might struggle to make money? Well, first of all, Doug Ford has intimate connections with a number of executives at Therma. Adrian Ion, the CFO of Therma, was previously the financial director of Aries Management, the company that bought Doug Ford's share of Deco Labels. Amir Remtula, Rob Ford's previous chief of staff, has worked as a lobbyist for Therma. If you want to go full conspiracy theory here, Rob Ford's widow suggested that Deco Labels has been losing money for years, and the purchase of Deco Labels happened shortly after the contract was awarded to Therma. I'm not saying those things are connected, but it's worth consideration. But in the end, it all might come down to something much less exciting: a parking lot. The province is contractually obligated to Therma to build dedicated parking spots for the spa. The estimate is that parking on site at Ontario Place would need to be expanded from its current capacity of 700 to around 2,700. All of the revenue from that parking lot would go straight back to the province. There is a parking lot across the street at Exhibition Place that's owned by the city, but part of the redevelopment plans are to convert some of that parking lot into bike parking, driving more people to the underground parking at Ontario Place. And now we get back to the Science Centre. The Doug Ford government promised a parking garage to Thermo before they planned to move the Science Centre. The parking garage is going to cost at least $300 million in taxpayer money. A report from the Auditor General backs up what many critics have been saying, that moving the Science Centre is a way to cover up and justify the massive cost to taxpayers of the new parking garage. But that still doesn't answer our first question: what's wrong with closing the current Science Centre? There are a number of factors here. First, to let Doug Ford off the hook a bit, the problems with the Science Centre's roof have been known about for years, and multiple governments have ignored them, passing on the costs of repairs to the next administration. The roof of the Science Centre is made out of a lightweight concrete called RAAC that is present in more than 400 buildings in Ontario, including schools and other public buildings, yet the Science Centre is the only building to be closed. The engineering report said that the roof tiles were at risk of collapsing come the first heavy snowfall of the year, but did not actually recommend closing the Science Centre. The tiles that need to be repaired are not over exhibit space, meaning the necessary repairs could be made without impacting or endangering the public visiting the attractions. Furthermore, Moriyama Tashima Architects, the firm that designed the building, said that its closing was unnecessary and offered to rehabilitate the building for free, not to mention a number of wealthy Canadians who have offered to pay for the repairs themselves. When it comes to the cost of repairs, part of the province's justification is that it's actually cheaper to build the new Science Centre than it is to repair the current building. Why throw millions at a building that is going to move in a few years anyways? The province estimates that repairs will cost around $370 million plus $109 million to upgrade its public spaces for a total of $478 million. The new building will only cost $384 million, including the cost of exhibits, almost $100 million less. Those numbers are largely nonsense. The cost of the new building assumes that its foundation and basement will be part of the parking lot development. But after the Auditor General report was released, Doug Ford and Olivia Chow have suggested the parking lot may be moved elsewhere. If that's the case, a separate foundation and basement will need to be constructed, likely costing hundreds of millions of dollars. The cost projection also doesn't include many of the costs of building. Permit fees, legal fees, consultants, inspections, project managers, etc., nor does it include the cost of a 150-meter-long two-story underground tunnel needed to connect the Science Centre building to the existing pods and Cinesphere, which will be part of the exhibits, nor does it include the cost of retrofitting the pods and Cinesphere in the first place. And on top of that, many experts estimate that the cost of repairing the Science Centre has been grossly inflated. There are a lot more reasons why the numbers don't make sense, but suffice to say the argument for not repairing the current centre doesn't hold water. To see the government's true motivation for closing the Science Centre, we need only look at the business proposal where these made-up numbers came from. There are significant sections of that business proposal devoted to something entirely different than the cost-benefit of a new location: the value of the land that the Science Centre currently sits on. The Science Centre's current location has been out in the middle of nowhere for most of its history, but in the coming years, 2 transit lines will converge exactly at that spot, making it valuable land. The business report suggests another use for that land: housing. I'm going to leave the land of research and facts here for a moment and just present a theory. The Science Centre is owned by the province, but the land is owned by the city. The Science Centre has a 99-year lease with the city, set to expire in 2064, that only allows for the construction of structures for purposes of operation as a science centre. Doug Ford's government accomplishes a number of things by closing the centre prematurely, despite promises that they would keep it open until 2028 when the new centre opened. First, they paint the current Science Centre building as dilapidated and unsafe, making a new building seem more appealing. and lessening the public's emotional and cultural connection with the building by removing it from use. Secondly, it makes it much more likely that the province can dump the cost of the science center onto the city. And if the city won't take the building, then the province just needs to wait until winter, where hopefully some of the roof will collapse so they can say the whole building needs to be demolished. And once it is, the only logical thing to do is renegotiate the lease, and why not redevelop the land as housing, perhaps with a contract awarded to one of the disgruntled developers who never got to develop the Greenbelt after all. Now, while this whole thing reeks of backroom deals and possible corruption, there's one more perspective I want to give time to. It's important to remember Liberal governments have been trying to privatize Ontario Place for over a decade. This is not a uniquely conservative thing. Would their plans have been as shady as this one? It's impossible to know, but I can almost guarantee that they would have involved the development of some of the public land that citizens are now fighting over. And yes, a mega spa will likely be a retreat for the wealthy, but Therma also plans to plant over 1,500 trees, further develop the waterfront, beaches, trails, paths, and public parkland that will remain free to the public. And Live Nation's development of Budweiser Stage will turn it from a seasonal venue to a year-round concert space and entertainment center. My point is, the development of Ontario Place may come with a variety of positives, resulting in the once beloved community hub being a prominent part of the city again. But the process to get there, going around public consultation and laws, awarding backroom deals to friends, and forcing the closure and relocation of one of Toronto's most beloved museums, are all deeply alarming. It seems that Doug Ford has learned from failing to develop the Greenbelt twice, and this time will let nothing stand in his way.